Duncan Cole had everything a man could want: power, wealth, influence, but it all felt hollow. Sitting behind the polished mahogany desk of his penthouse office, the view of the city skyline seemed more like a cage than a privilege. At 45, Duncan was the CEO of Cole Enterprises, an international conglomerate that spanned everything from luxury real estate to biomedicine. He had built it from the ground up, and yet, as he looked out over the sprawling metropolis below, he felt a deep sense of emptiness gnawing at him. The world he had created was a carefully curated illusion. His employees adored him, his board members revered him, and the media had made him a symbol of success. But behind the glossy facade, Duncan felt like a ghost, a man who had sold his soul for the very empire that now weighed heavily on his shoulders. He was surrounded by sycophants, all of them polished, all of them pretending to admire the man he was. But none of them really knew him. None of them knew the real Duncan, the man who had come from humble beginnings in a small town in Michigan. And so, every few months, Duncan performed a strange ritual. He would shed the skin of Duncan Cole, the self-made billionaire, and transform into a different person, someone anonymous, someone ordinary. This was his way of reconnecting with the world beyond his glass towers, his way of finding something real amidst all the pretense. He called it his pilgrimage to truth, and tonight it would take him to the Sterling Plate, one of his high-end restaurants located in the heart of Chicago. He had worn the same disguise before, old clothes, the kind someone might wear if they were down on their luck. Duncan carefully selected a worn leather jacket from a thrift store and paired it with faded jeans, a plaid shirt with fraying cuffs, and scuffed boots that had clearly seen better days. He didn't bother with shaving, leaving his face covered in the scruff that had accumulated over the past few days. He even slipped on a pair of thick, non-prescription glasses that made him look more like an accountant than a billionaire. In the cracked mirror of his apartment's hallway, he hardly recognized himself. The man who stared back at him wasn't the CEO of a billion-dollar corporation. He looked like someone who might be scraping by, barely making rent. That was the point of the disguise. The anonymity was his escape. As he took one last look at his reflection, he felt the weight of his usual persona begin to melt away. Tonight, he wasn't Duncan Cole, the billionaire. He was just Jim, the man in the crowd. Stepping out of his penthouse, Duncan, now Jim, took a deep breath of the cool evening air. The streets of Chicago were alive with the buzz of the city, the distant sound of car horns, the chatter of pedestrians, the hum of busy restaurants and bars. It was a world far removed from his usual reality. Jim felt something he hadn't in years: freedom. His black luxury sedan pulled up to the Sterling Plate, a restaurant that was a crown jewel in his portfolio. It had been a significant acquisition, one of the best investments he had ever made. The restaurant boasted a world-class menu and had become a hotspot for the city's elite. The last thing the restaurant needed was a real billionaire walking in the door. But Jim wasn't here for the food. He wasn't even here to check on the profits or the efficiency of his staff. He was here to find something that money couldn't buy: truth. He entered through the restaurant's ornate front doors, where the buzz of conversation and the clinking of silverware immediately hit him. The air was thick with the smell of seared steaks, aged wine, and freshly baked bread. The dim, golden light reflected off the gleaming marble floors. The hostess, a young woman with a radiant smile, took one look at his shabby appearance and immediately sized him up. "Table for one?" she asked, her voice polite but tinged with judgment. "Yes, please," Jim replied, his voice rougher than usual. The hostess hesitated for a moment before leading him to a small, inconspicuous table near the kitchen entrance. The other patrons were dressed in evening wear, their laughter and conversation filled with the clatter of glasses. The well-dressed men and women sitting at the prime tables took no notice of him. He didn't belong in their world. Jim sat at the table and observed the restaurant through the eyes of someone who was not part of the elite world he had built. The waitstaff moved with precision, each of them offering polite, professional smiles. But Jim could tell it was all a performance. The polished surfaces of the restaurant, the expensive decor, the perfectly timed service. It was all a carefully constructed facade, just like his own life. The manager, a tall, dark-haired man named Edward Finch, hovered nearby, making small talk with a group of wealthy businessmen. Jim watched the man closely. Finch was smooth, his charm calculated, and yet there was something unnerving about him. The way his smile never quite reached his eyes, the way he quickly flicked a look at the kitchen, as if ensuring everything was running perfectly. It was all too staged. As Jim sat in the corner, his mind began to race. This was the world he had created, a world of polished surfaces and hidden truths. The restaurant was making millions in revenue, yet it felt empty, soulless. Jim's empire had expanded far beyond his initial dreams, but somewhere along the way, he had lost his connection to the people who actually worked for him. His employees, his customers, the public, they all saw him as a symbol of success, but none of them really knew who he was. None of them knew the lonely man who hid behind the billionaire mask. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was just another cog in a massive machine. The machine of wealth and power, a machine that reduced people to mere numbers on a spreadsheet. The world he had built was flawless on the outside, but like a gold-plated statue, it was hollow on the inside. Jim ordered a $500 Emperor's Cut steak, something he would never normally indulge in. It wasn't about the meal, it was about the test. He wanted to see how the staff would treat him. Would they recognize him as a fraud, or would they treat him like just another customer? As the waiter delivered the steak, Jim observed him closely. The waiter's eyes flicked down to his attire, then quickly back up, trying to mask his discomfort. The meal was spectacular, but Jim wasn't eating for pleasure. He was observing, silently assessing the authenticity of the world around him. The fine wine, the decadent cut of meat, the indifferent service, it was all part of the grand performance. Jim chewed slowly, savoring each bite, but also thinking about the things that really mattered. Truth, honesty, connection, none of it. It could be bought. He finished the meal in silence, watching the world around him as the night wore on. And then, just as he was about to leave, the janitor, a black man in his mid-50s, walked by. Jim noticed something odd. The janitor was different from the rest of the staff. His expression wasn't that of someone just doing his job. There was something in his eyes, something searching. As the janitor cleared the table, he subtly slipped a folded napkin onto Jim's plate. Jim's heart skipped a beat. What was this? He thought. A note? Perhaps a plea for money, or a secret message. With trembling hands, Jim unfolded the napkin. 4 words. They're watching you. The kitchen is not safe. Jim's breath caught in his throat. What did it mean? Why would the janitor, who seemed so ordinary, so lost, leave him this cryptic message? His mind raced as he tried to understand what was happening. This wasn't just a plea for help. This was something much bigger. And for the first time that night, Jim felt a spark of curiosity that had long been absent in his life. Who was this janitor, and what was he trying to tell him? Rosemary Vance had always been the type of person who did her best to stay unnoticed. At just 24, she had learned the hard way that the world didn't care for people like her. She'd grown up in a small apartment on the south side of Chicago, a neighborhood where dreams often came with a hefty price, and hope was something you couldn't hold on to for too long. After her mother passed away from cancer a few years ago, it was just her and her younger brother Kevin who had been diagnosed with a severe genetic disorder. His condition was getting worse, and Rosemary had done everything she could to ensure he got the treatment he needed. She didn't care about the harsh stares of her co-workers or the cold treatment from the other staff members. All she cared about was getting through each day, making enough money to keep the lights on, and paying for Kevin's medical treatments. Working at the Sterling Plate was the only thing that paid enough to cover their medical bills. It wasn't much, but it was something. At the end of the day, that was all that mattered. She had learned to smile when necessary and to keep the cracks hidden behind a veil of politeness. But every once in a while, when the stress and exhaustion took over, she would catch herself. In the mirror, her eyes tired, her smile forced, and she'd wonder how long she could keep up the act. Tonight, as she moved around the restaurant, pushing her cart and cleaning up the tables, she noticed a man sitting alone at a table near the kitchen entrance. The man, dressed in worn clothes that looked like they belonged to a much poorer man, caught her attention. There was something about him that didn't quite fit with the typical crowd that dined here. Her first instinct was to brush him off. After all, the sterling plate catered to the elite, to businessmen in tailored suits and women wearing diamonds. But there was something about him. His eyes were different. He didn't look like someone playing a role. He looked lost. Not in the way a man with too many drinks might look, but in the way someone might feel after carrying a burden for too long. Rosemary approached the table, keeping her voice steady as she introduced herself. "Good evening, sir. My name is Rosemary, and I'll be cleaning up around here tonight. Is everything okay?" The man, whose name she learned was Jameson, gazed up at her. His eyes were sharp, almost too sharp for someone who appeared so ordinary. He didn't fidget. He didn't make small talk. He simply looked at her as though sizing her up. "Just water, thanks," he replied. His voice was deep, a little rough around the edges. "And I'll have the Emperor's cut, please. Medium rare." The order was strange. The Emperor's cut was the most expensive item on the menu. For a moment, Rosemary thought it might be a joke. A food critic, perhaps? But there was no hint of humor in his voice. He didn't seem like the type to be flaunting his wealth for attention. She nodded politely, trying not to let her unease show. As she walked away, she noticed something odd. His boots. They were scuffed and worn out, like someone who worked for a living, not someone who spent his time in places like this. And yet, he was ordering the most extravagant dish on the menu, a $500 steak. Dinner service moved on, but Rosemary couldn't shake the thought of Jameson at table 32. There was something about him that felt different from the usual crowd, something that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she could stop pretending for a second. As she cleared his plate, her hands trembled slightly. It had been a long, grueling shift, and she was running on fumes. She wanted to make it through the night without any incidents, just get to the end of her shift, go home, and focus on Kevin. But then, as she collected the empty plate, she slipped a folded napkin toward Jameson's side of the table. It was an instinct, a quiet action that felt right in a moment of silent desperation. She didn't know why she did it. Maybe she thought he was different. Maybe she just needed to reach out to someone who might understand, even if they never spoke a word. Her heart pounded as she walked away. She had no idea what would happen next. She hadn't seen anyone slip a note like that to a customer before. Not in her years of working here. She didn't even want to think about what would happen if Finch caught her. If he saw her acting out of line, there would be no mercy. He had threatened her job too many times before. She couldn't risk it, but as she glanced over her shoulder at Jameson's table, she saw him pick up the napkin. Her chest tightened with anticipation. That night, as Rosemary stood in the employee break room, she allowed herself a few moments to breathe. She rubbed her temples, trying to shake the exhaustion that had taken over her body. Her thoughts wandered. Back to Kevin. He had just had another round of treatments at the hospital, and the bills were piling up. The medical debt, the late fees, the loans. It was all too much. But she kept pushing through, hoping that someday things would get better. But, deep down, she knew she was running out of time. The doctors had told her that Kevin's condition was progressing faster than they had anticipated. She was doing everything she could to keep him alive, but sometimes it didn't feel like it was enough. Every day was a battle, an uphill climb that seemed to get steeper. As Rosemary sat down, she felt the weight of it all. The lies she had told herself and the lies she had told others. Her family, her friends, her co-workers, no one knew the truth about what was happening at home. No one knew the full extent of the danger hanging over her head or the decisions she was forced to make. But now there was a chance for something to change. Jameson, the man in the plaid shirt, had noticed her. He had seen something in her, something she couldn't hide anymore, and she had taken a risk, slipping him that note. She didn't know what he would do with it, but she felt a spark of hope ignite inside her. Maybe, just maybe, this stranger could help. Jameson sat back in his seat, the clinking of silverware and the hum of conversations around him fading into the background. His mind raced. He couldn't shake the cryptic note Rosemary had left him. "They're watching you. The kitchen is not safe." He stared down at the napkin, the weight of the words pressing down on him like a cold hand on his chest. There was something off about this place, something darker than just overpriced meals and posh decor. He knew this restaurant well. The sterling plate was the crown jewel of his empire. But tonight, it felt like a house of cards about to collapse. The surface was perfect, immaculate. The floors gleamed, the wine flowed. But what was beneath it all? What were the walls hiding? Finch, the manager, was too polished, too smooth in his interactions with the guests. Jameson could see through him. He wasn't just a manager. He was a puppet master, pulling strings from behind the scenes. Jameson leaned back in his chair and took another sip of water, trying to make sense of it. He had built Cole Enterprises from nothing, but something about this restaurant felt different. The staff, the food, the atmosphere, it was all too flawless. But he wasn't here for the ambiance or the luxury. He was here to find the truth. His thoughts turned back to Rosemary, the young janitor. She had handed him that note without hesitation. What was her connection to this? Did she know something about the dark underbelly of the restaurant that no one else did? And why had she chosen to slip him a message? She had seen something in him. He could feel it, even if he didn't fully understand it yet. Over the next few days, Jameson decided to dig deeper. He didn't call his team in for an audit. He didn't want to alert anyone that something was wrong. Instead, he visited the sterling plate under the guise of anonymity. He donned his gym persona once again, wearing his shabby clothes and hiding his identity behind thick glasses and an unshaved face. He blended into the shadows, watching the staff, the manager, and the flow of customers as if he were an outsider in his own world. What he observed didn't surprise him, but angered him all the same. Finch, who had always presented himself as a charismatic and capable leader, was a fraud. Jameson watched as Finch manipulated the staff, using his position to control and intimidate them. The way Finch barked orders at the waiters, the way he made subtle threats to those who dared to speak out. There was no kindness, no humanity in the way he ran the restaurant. It was all about control, but it was what Jameson found in the back office that truly set his alarm bells ringing. The office was a reflection of Finch's true nature, a shrine to power and ego. Photos of Finch at golf with city officials, social media posts about his lavish lifestyle, and behind it all, hidden in plain sight, were the financial discrepancies. Jameson rifled through the drawers, looking for anything that might shed light on the restaurant's operations. There, in a folder labeled "Private, Not for Public Eyes," he found a set of financial reports that didn't match the usual accounting style. The figures were doctored, the margins were inflated to hide transactions that didn't make sense. And that's when it hit him. The restaurant was laundering money. He scanned the pages, his eyes widening in disbelief as he realized the extent of the deception. Tainted meat, non-existent suppliers. Finch had been buying contaminated food from shady, unregistered sources and passing it off as the finest cuts of meat, all while pocketing the difference. It was a crime, one that could destroy the reputation of the sterling plate, his entire hospitality empire, and everything Duncan had built. Jameson couldn't stop thinking about Rosemary. What had prompted her to pass him that note? There had to be a reason, and it went beyond the simple idea of her being a disgruntled employee. No, this was deeper. She had seen something, felt something that he had missed. As he continued to observe the restaurant, he learned more about Rosemary's life. Her struggles with her brother's health, her constant battle to make ends meet, and her resilience in the face of hardship. But it was the look in her eyes when she saw him, when she caught him staring at her as she passed the note, that haunted him. There was fear, yes, but there was also a sense of defiance, a sense that she was willing to risk everything to get the truth out. Jameson started to piece together the connections. Rosemary was more than just a janitor at the Sterling plate. She had become entangled in something far bigger than herself. As he investigated further, he discovered her fear of Finch's retaliation, how he had manipulated her into working with him on the fake invoices. She was trapped, doing the work she hated to keep her brother's medical bills paid. The truth about the supply chain wasn't just a threat to the restaurant, it was a threat to her life. The more Jameson dug, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about the restaurant or its tainted food. It was about justice, and it was about giving someone like Rosemary a chance to break free from the chains that bound her. He couldn't let this slide. He couldn't let Finch's corruption continue, nor could he allow someone like Rosemary, who had risked everything for the truth, to be left in the dark. Jameson knew what he had to do. He couldn't just expose Finch's crimes in the shadows. He had to go public, and he had to make sure that Rosemary, the true hero of the story, was safe. That night, he called his COO, Arthur Pendleton, with a plan. "Arthur, it's time to take down Finch. We've got everything we need, but there's someone else who needs to be protected, Rosemary." The next day, after spending hours poring over the records and piecing together the puzzle, Jameson decided to take matters into his own hands. He could no longer wait for someone else to uncover the truth. Every second Finch was in charge meant more lies, more corruption, and more lives caught in the web of deceit. Dressed once again as Jim, he slipped into the shadow of his own restaurant under the guise of a lowly customer. It was a risky move. Finch had likely grown suspicious after Jameson's last undercover visit, and the idea of walking into the heart of his empire again was a dangerous gamble. But Jameson knew this was the only way to get the full picture. He needed to see everything. He needed to find out how deep Finch's corruption ran and what the man would do to protect his empire. As Jameson walked past the rows of plush tables, finely dressed patrons, and polished staff, he felt the weight of the place bear down on him. The opulence that had once dazzled him now felt like a facade, a glossy, pristine image hiding a festering wound beneath the surface. This was where everything had gone wrong, where his empire, born from dreams of success and greatness, had turned into a machine of exploitation. He glanced toward the back of the restaurant, where Edward Finch stood, speaking animatedly with a small group of high-profile clients. The way Finch acted, the way he managed every detail, it was a performance, carefully curated, perfectly timed. He wasn't just a manager, he was a puppet master, pulling strings behind the curtain to make sure everyone stayed in line, from the staff to the customers. Jameson knew it was time. He needed answers, and he needed to be discreet about it. Every move he made had to be calculated. Jameson hadn't expected to find Rosemary so easily, but she was right where he thought she would be, mopping the floor near the kitchen entrance, her eyes scanning the room like she was constantly on guard. She moved methodically, not wasting a single second, her weary expression betraying the exhaustion that had become her daily companion. As he watched her, Jameson's heart ached. She was different from the rest of the staff. While they offered polite smiles to the elite guests, Rosemary wore her sincerity like a badge of honor. There was no pretense in her actions, no act of superiority, no hidden agendas. She was simply trying to survive, trying to protect her brother, while navigating the maze of manipulation and deceit created by people like Finch. Jameson took a deep breath and approached her quietly. She didn't notice him at first, so wrapped up in her work, but as soon as their eyes met, she froze. There was a flicker of recognition, followed by a flash of fear. Her face paled as she quickly looked away, but it was too late. Jameson had already seen the truth. "Rosemary," Jameson said softly, careful to keep his voice low, "we need to talk." Her body tensed, and her eyes darted nervously toward Finch's office in the distance. He could tell she was debating whether or not she should even acknowledge him. The fear in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. She was terrified. "Is everything okay?" he asked, trying to offer her a reassuring smile. She hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing the risk of speaking freely. Finally, she spoke, in a quiet, shaky voice. I've been trying to keep my head down, Mr. Cole. I don't want any trouble. I just need the job." Jameson nodded, understanding the unspoken message. She was scared of losing everything, scared of Finch, and scared of what might happen if anyone found out she had confided in him. "Rosemary, I know what Finch is doing," Jameson said, his voice calm but firm. "I know about the fake invoices and the tainted meat. I want to help you." Her eyes widened, and she stepped closer, glancing around the room as if someone might overhear them. "Please, Mr. Cole, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just trying to make sure Kevin gets the care he needs. Please, don't do anything that might get me in trouble." Jameson's heart sank. She had been coerced into this, used as a pawn in Finch's game. He could see it now, the threats, the blackmail, the pressure that had forced her to become complicit. In Finch's crimes, she wasn't a willing participant, she was a victim. "I know," he said, his voice filled with empathy. "And I'm going to make sure Finch is held accountable for everything he's done. You don't have to live in fear anymore." Later that evening, after hours of observing and quietly gathering more evidence, Jameson finally made his move. He slipped away from the main dining room and headed straight for Finch's office. His heart raced as he neared the door, and he could hear the muffled sound of conversation and clinking glasses in the distance. But here, in this small, dimly lit corner of the restaurant, it was just him and the secrets Finch had been hiding. Jameson reached for the door handle, his breath shallow as he carefully twisted it open. The office was dark, but there was enough light from the city outside to illuminate the desk and shelves piled with paperwork. He knew exactly where to look. The files in Finch's drawer. The folders were neatly arranged, but the ones that caught his eye were those with handwritten labels. He slid the drawer open and pulled them out carefully. What he found sent a shockwave through him. Invoices, falsified documents, transactions marked as suspicious and untraceable. And then, tucked at the back of the folder, he found the real kicker. A list of suppliers, including Prime Organic Meats, a company that had been shut down for health violations months ago. Finch had been buying condemned toxic meat from them and reselling it at a premium. The air seemed to thicken around Jameson as the full extent of the corruption hit him. Finch was poisoning his customers for profit, all while keeping the restaurant's image pristine. But as he turned to leave, a sudden noise from the hallway made him freeze. It was Finch. He was coming back. Without a second thought, Jameson stuffed the files back into the drawer, closed it quietly, and slipped out of the office before Finch could enter. Jameson stood in the hallway for a moment, his hands shaking. What had just happened? He had uncovered the truth, but now the real work began. Finch had to be stopped, and it was up to him to make sure justice was served. He knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed help. Arthur Pendleton, his COO, and Wren, the former MI6 agent who had already helped him before. But there was something else he needed to do, something he couldn't ignore any longer. He had to protect Rosemary. Jameson knew the clock was ticking. The longer Finch remained in control, the more damage he could do to his business, to his employees, and to the people who had become caught in his web of corruption. The financial discrepancies, the fake suppliers, the poisoned meat, it all pointed to one thing. Finch had to be stopped, and Jameson wasn't going to let the man destroy his empire or the lives of those like Rosemary without a fight. He paced, back and forth in his office, his mind racing. The evidence was there, but it needed to be secured. The ledger and the fraudulent invoices were crucial. If Finch caught wind of what was happening, they could be gone in a heartbeat. The only way to ensure the files were in the right hands was to take them now, before anyone had a chance to destroy them. Jameson picked up the phone and dialed Arthur Pendleton, his COO, and a man who had always been more like a brother than A business partner, Arthur, Jameson said, his voice tight with urgency. We need to move fast. I've got the evidence on Finch, but I need you to get me the rest of the team. It's time to take him down. Arthur's voice was steady on the other end. I'll get everything in place. You know we can't just go in without planning. I know, Jameson replied, his mind already racing through the details. True. But we can't wait any longer. We need that ledger, and we need it tonight. I'll handle it from this end. Just get the team ready. He hung up and turned to Wren, the former MI6 operative who had helped him before. She was a woman of few words, but in this moment, Jameson knew she would be the key to making sure everything went according to plan. Wren, he said, his voice low, it's time to take Finch down. I need you to break into his office tonight, get that ledger, and get out without anyone noticing. Can you handle it? Wren looked at him with an almost unreadable expression, her sharp eyes assessing him for a moment before she nodded. I can handle it. We'll be in and out before anyone even knows we're there. Jameson smiled, relieved. Wren was a professional. She wasn't just skilled in physical infiltration, she was a master at reading people, understanding situations, and staying one step ahead. Good, he said. Let's get moving. We don't have much time. That evening, Jameson donned his disguise once again. The shabby clothes, the worn boots, the frayed plaid shirt, they were his ticket into Finch's world, a world where he wasn't a billionaire CEO, but just another man in the crowd. This time, the disguise wasn't just for anonymity. It was his ticket to walking through the front door and infiltrating the heart of the empire Finch had built. He glanced at himself in the mirror, barely recognizing the man staring back at him. The sleek, polished version of himself was long gone. Now he was Jim, the man who had no wealth, no power, just the desire to see through the lies and to bring justice to those who had been exploited. Ready? Wren's voice broke his concentration, and he turned to find her already dressed in a dark, inconspicuous cleaning uniform. She looked the part of a janitor, and that was exactly what they needed. Jameson nodded. Let's do this. They left the penthouse and made their way to the Sterling Plate, moving through the bustling streets of Chicago as quietly as shadows. Once they arrived, they slipped in through the back service entrance, unnoticed by the rest of the staff. The smell of seared meat and fine wine lingered in the air, but Jameson wasn't here for the food. This wasn't about luxury or comfort anymore. It was about taking back control. Jameson and Wren moved through the restaurant, blending in with the late-night cleaning crew as they made their way to Finch's office. It was a small, claustrophobic room, tucked away in the back, but to Finch it was a kingdom. The walls were lined with expensive books, photos of Finch with city officials, and various mementos of his success. But it wasn't the decor that mattered. It was what was inside the desk drawers, the real evidence that could destroy everything Finch had worked to conceal. Wren led the way, her movements fluid and precise. She had done this countless times before. She worked quickly, using her tools to disable the security system and unlock the office door without a sound. Jameson stood watch, his eyes darting around the hallway as he listened for any sign that someone might be coming. The tension in the air was palpable. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, and his mind kept flashing back to Rosemary. Was she safe? Would Finch come after her once he realized what was happening? Finally, Wren whispered, "We're in." The office was dimly lit by the glow of the city lights outside, casting long shadows across Finch's desk. Wren moved quickly, pulling open drawers and rifling through files until she found what she was looking for, the ledger. "This is it," she said, her voice barely audible. She slipped the book into her bag, and Jameson exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, but just as they were about to leave, they heard footsteps echoing down the hall. Finch was coming. Jameson's heart raced as Wren stuffed the ledger into her bag and motioned for him to follow. They had to move fast. They slipped out of Finch's office just as he rounded the corner. Jameson's pulse quickened, but he kept his cool, ducking behind a stack of cleaning supplies as Finch passed by, oblivious to their presence. Every fiber of Jameson's being screamed for them to get out, to finish what they had started. As they made their way to the service exit, the adrenaline coursing through his veins, Jameson knew this was just the beginning. They had the proof. Now, Finch's empire would fall and Rosemary would be free. But there was still one final piece to the puzzle. The tension in the air was thick as Jameson and Wren slipped into the dimly lit parking garage. The mission had been a success, but it wasn't over yet. They had the ledger, the damning evidence of Finch's corruption, but Jameson knew it was time to confront the man who had brought this all crashing down. The plan was set. It had to be done carefully. There was no turning back now. They couldn't afford to wait. Finch had to be taken down, and Jameson needed to ensure the truth came to light before the man could escape, destroy the evidence, or retaliate. Arthur's. "On standby," Jameson said, his voice steady. "As soon as we make our move, everything will fall into place. You ready?" Wren nodded, her face calm as ever, though Jameson knew better than to read too much into her stoic demeanor. Wren had a way of appearing unfazed, but behind that exterior was a woman who had been through the fires of countless operations. She wasn't just ready, she was prepared. They made their way through the back door of the Sterling Plate, bypassing the main kitchen and staff areas to keep a low profile. Every corner they turned brought them closer to Finch's office, the heart of his corrupt empire. Jameson could already hear his voice echoing down the hallway, the sound of someone who was far too confident, far too comfortable with their position. Finch was on the phone when they arrived, his voice low but filled with the unmistakable arrogance that had come to define him. Jameson and Wren paused outside the office, listening carefully to his words. "We'll have the next shipment of organic meat by tomorrow," Finch said, his tone smooth. "Make sure no one finds out where it's coming from. I don't need anyone breathing down my neck." Jameson felt a surge of disgust. Finch was talking about toxic meat, the very thing that had poisoned customers and tarnished the reputation of Cole Enterprises. But it wasn't just the business that angered him, it was the man. Finch was the embodiment of greed and deceit. He used his position to manipulate and control, and it was time for it to end. With the sound of Finch's voice still ringing in his ears, Jameson pushed open the door to the office. The room was exactly as he remembered it, a shrine to Finch's ego, with pictures of him posing with city officials and his favorite golf trophies on display. The man himself stood behind his desk, looking up with a sneer when he saw who had entered. "Well, well," Finch said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "If it isn't Mr. Cole, the man who thinks he can run the world. What's this? A surprise? Audit?" Jameson didn't flinch at Finch's mockery. He stood tall, his voice cold and steady, as he replied, "It's not an audit, Finch. This is your reckoning." Finch's eyes narrowed. "What the hell are you talking about?" Jameson threw a folder onto the desk, letting the ledger fall open. "I've seen everything, Finch. The invoices, the suppliers, the poisoned meat. You thought you could hide all this under the radar, but I have everything right here." Finch's expression shifted, but he didn't panic. "Not yet. You don't know what you're talking about. That's just some paperwork I keep for the books, nothing serious." He chuckled, though the unease was beginning to show through. Jameson leaned in, his voice low but unyielding. "Don't lie to me. You've been running a scam with contaminated food, using the restaurant as a front for your dirty money. You're going down, Finch." The color drained from Finch's face. His hand shook as he reached for the phone on his desk, but Jameson was quicker. Before Finch could make a call, Jameson grabbed the phone from his hand and threw it across the room. "You're not calling anyone," Jameson said, his voice like steel. "It's over, Finch. The authorities are already on their way. You're finished." Just as Finch opened his mouth to protest, the door to the office swung open again. This time, it wasn't just Jameson and Wren who had come to make their stand. Rosemary stepped into the room, her face a mixture of determination and fear. She stood tall, her hands clenched at her sides. Her eyes were focused on Finch, and for the first time there was no fear in her expression. Only the resolve of someone who had been pushed to the edge and was no longer afraid to stand up for herself. Finch's gaze flickered nervously at her. "What is this, Rosemary?" he sneered. "You think you can just walk in here and accuse me of—" "No," Rosemary interrupted, her voice strong. "I've had enough of this. You've been using me. You've been threatening me, controlling me, all because you knew I was desperate. But I'm done." Her words rang through the office, cutting through the tension in the air. Finch's mask of control was slipping, and the power he had wielded over her, over everyone, was crumbling. Jameson looked at Rosemary, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. This woman, this courageous woman, had risked everything to expose the truth. She was the hero of this story, not him. "Finch," Jameson said, his tone like a judge's final verdict. "You're under arrest for fraud, food safety violations, and blackmail. You've done enough damage." As the police arrived and Finch was led out of the office in handcuffs, Jameson stood in the center of the room, taking in the scene. It was a strange feeling, standing in a place that had been a symbol of corruption for so long, now turned into the scene of a reckoning. Rosemary stood beside him, her expression a mix of exhaustion and relief. The fight was over, and she had won. She had exposed Finch for the criminal he was, and now justice would be served. Jameson turned to her. "You did the right thing, Rosemary. This place was never going to change without someone like you standing up." Her eyes softened. "I didn't think I had it in me," she admitted, her voice quiet. "But when you're pushed to the edge, you do things you never thought possible." Jameson nodded, understanding more than she knew. He reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "From now on, this is your fight, too." As the police took Finch away and the restaurant staff began to process what had just happened, Jameson and Rosemary stood in the middle of the chaos, realizing that for the first time in a long while, the truth had triumphed, and that, in the end, was what truly mattered. The next morning, as the dust began to settle, the Sterling plate was still in turmoil. Finch had been arrested, and the authorities were combing through every inch of the restaurant, from the kitchens to the office. The media frenzy had already started. News outlets were reporting the story about how one of the city's most famous fine dining establishments had been using contaminated meat, laundering money, and blackmailing employees. The story was gaining traction, and it was only a matter of time before the full scope of Finch's crimes became public knowledge. For Jameson, it was a strange feeling. He had spent so many years building Cole Enterprises, expanding his empire, focusing on profits, numbers, and growth. But today, standing outside the restaurant, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, not in the empire he had built, but in the courage of a woman who had fought back against a man who had taken advantage of her. Rosemary Vance. She had risked everything to expose the truth, and now her bravery was going to change the course of both her life and the lives of those around her. Jameson had arranged for Arthur Pendleton, his trusted COO, to take over the restaurant's operations, temporarily. Arthur had made it clear that the company would work quickly to restore the restaurant's reputation. The Sterling plate would be under new management, and everything associated with Finch's corrupt dealings would be severed immediately. As Jameson walked into his office, Rosemary was waiting for him. She had been offered a seat at the back of the restaurant, out of sight of the media, to avoid attracting attention. Her hands were folded in her lap, her eyes focused on the table, but there was a new determination in the way she carried herself. "Rosemary," Jameson began, his voice warm but serious, "you've done something incredible. I want you to know that. You've given up everything to make sure people like Finch can't get away with their lies anymore." Her lips twitched, a faint smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. "I didn't do it alone. You were the one who gave me the courage to speak up. I had to take the chance." Jameson nodded. "And you did. You saved more than just this restaurant. You saved so many people from suffering. Now, it's time for you to take control." Rosemary's brows furrowed. "What do you mean? After everything that's happened, I want to offer you a position at Cole Enterprises, not just as an employee, but as someone who can make a real change." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You're too valuable to remain in the shadows. You deserve more than cleaning floors for a living. You're capable of much more. I want to make you the director of ethical oversight." Rosemary blinked, taken aback. "Director? Are you serious?" Absolutely. I've seen your integrity. I've seen how you've stuck to your values, even when the world tried to break you. You understand what it means to do the right thing when no one's watching. You've proven you can make a difference. I want you to be the one who ensures that this company never loses sight of its moral compass again. She sat there, stunned, director of ethical oversight. The thought of it seemed surreal. From a janitor cleaning floors at a high-end restaurant to now being in charge of something as important as the company's ethics. The weight of the responsibility almost overwhelmed her. "I don't know what to say," she said quietly, her voice shaking slightly. "This feels impossible." Jameson smiled softly. "I know it's a big leap, but I believe in you, Rosemary. You've already proven that you're the kind of person who will make things right. And it's not just about cleaning up the mess. It's about ensuring it doesn't happen again." She exhaled a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she slowly nodded. "I'll do it. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again." Jameson's eyes softened with pride. "Good. And don't worry. We'll make sure Kevin's medical bills are covered too. I've already spoken to my team, and we've set up a trust fund for him. You don't have to worry about that anymore." Her eyes filled with tears, and she quickly wiped them away. "Thank you. You don't know how much this means to me." Jameson nodded, his voice gentle. "It's the least I can do." The next few weeks were spent rebuilding the Sterling plate from the ground up. The media attention had been relentless, but with Arthur Pendleton overseeing the transition and Jameson's guidance, the restaurant slowly regained the trust of its patrons. The kitchen was cleaned out, new suppliers were brought in, and the once tainted reputation of the restaurant was starting to improve. But it wasn't just about the food anymore. Rosemary's leadership was what made the difference. She worked tirelessly, meeting with the staff, ensuring that they were treated with respect, and creating a culture where honesty and integrity were valued above all else. She also created new employee welfare programs aimed at providing a support system for those in need, especially workers who had been exploited in the past. The restaurant was becoming a place that not only provided excellent service, but also took care of its staff. One late afternoon, after the restaurant had closed, Jameson stood in the newly renovated office, looking out over the city from the large windows. He had transformed from a man driven only by wealth to someone who had rediscovered the value of truth and human connection. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Rosemary walking in, her expression serene but resolute. She had become more than just an employee. She was now part of his vision for Cole Enterprises, a vision grounded in integrity and honesty. "How's everything going?" Jameson asked, his voice genuine. "Better than I could have ever hoped," Rosemary replied, her smile wide. "The staff is responding well. They're starting to trust me. And more importantly, they're starting to trust each other." Jameson's chest swelled with pride. "Good. We're not just rebuilding a restaurant here. We're building something far more important. We're building a legacy." Rosemary nodded, her face lighting up with the same fire she'd shown when she took that first step toward exposing the truth. "And we're doing it the right way." Jameson smiled. The empire was changing, and it was for the better. The right people were now at the helm, leading the charge toward a more honest, ethical future. As the city lights blinked on in the distance, Jameson knew this was only the beginning. The story of Rosemary Vance, the janitor who had become the hero, was only one chapter in the larger narrative of his life. But it was a story worth telling, a story about how courage and truth could change everything.